The first thing he called me was a roach. The second thing he called me was a thief. And by the time he put both hands on my chest and shoved me away from that piano, 300 people had already decided not to see it. My cane struck the marble floor and rolled beneath a banquet table. Somebody laughed near the champagne tower, and Victor Langley leaned close enough for me to smell the bourbon on his breath when he said, "Go on then, janitor. Show us what those bleach-burned hands can do." What he did not know was that those same hands had once played for governors, ambassadors, and a queen who stood up before the final note had faded, but that was a different life. And on that cold Friday morning in Philadelphia, I was just Isaiah Bennett, 59 years old, legally blind, 6 weeks behind on rent, and wearing a brown maintenance uniform with a name patch stitched crooked over the pocket. I woke at 5:10 every morning because the pipes in my apartment started knocking at 5:08. 2 hard bangs followed by a long metallic groan that sounded like an old freight train dragging itself uphill. My wife, Ruth, used to complain about it, said the building was trying to communicate in Morse code. And every morning she would translate the same message. Get out while you still can. Ruth had been gone 7 years by then, taken by an aneurysm so sudden that I still sometimes reached across the mattress before remembering there was nobody there. She had been the organized one, the kind of woman who labeled kitchen drawers, matched socks before folding them, and kept emergency money inside an empty oatmeal tin because, according to her, no burglar with self-respect would steal plain oats. When my eyesight began fading from glaucoma, she turned her apartment into a map I could read with my hands, rubber bands around the coffee jar, raised tape on the stove settings, 3 small beads glued to the front door lock so I could find the keyhole without scraping the paint. Even after she died, her little system kept taking care of me, which was comforting and cruel at the same time. I counted 11 steps from the bed to the bathroom, 9 from the bathroom to the kitchen, and 6 from the kitchen table to the front door. I knew which floorboard creaked, where the wallpaper curled, and how far to lean before my hip found the edge of the counter. People think blindness means living in darkness, but darkness is the easy part. The hard part is living in a world that keeps moving things and then blaming you for not knowing where they went. That morning I ironed my uniform by touch, pressed the collar flat, checked the buttons twice, and pinned my badge where Ruth had always told me it looked respectable. She used to say, "A job does not decide your dignity, Isaiah. You decide how much dignity you bring to it." I had spent 8 years working nights at the Halcyon Crown Hotel, one of those old downtown places with gold elevators, imported stone, and employees trained to apologize before guests had even complained. The lobby smelled like lemon polish, expensive perfume, and money that had never worried about rent. I cleaned that lobby 6 nights a week, emptied crystal ashtrays nobody was supposed to use, scrubbed shoe marks from Italian tile, and polished brass rails until they reflected faces I could no longer see. Most guests treated me the way people treat a coat rack, stepping around me without speaking, leaving cups on my cart, sometimes snapping their fingers when they wanted directions, as if blindness had somehow turned me into a hotel appliance. I was not angry about it anymore. Not exactly. Anger takes energy and I had bills. My friend Marcus Reed worked security on the overnight shift. 42 years old, 6'4", built like a refrigerator somebody taught to smile. Marcus had a habit of announcing himself from 20 feet away because he knew sudden footsteps made me tense. "Here comes your favorite underpaid hero," he would say, then steal one of the peppermints I kept in my shirt pocket. He was the only person at the hotel who knew I played piano, though even he did not know how far that story went. 3 years earlier, he had found me in the employee lounge after midnight, sitting at an upright piano missing 2 ivory caps and 1 pedal. I thought the building was empty, so I played an old arrangement of Summertime, not for an audience, just because Ruth had loved it and grief gets restless when you keep it locked up too long. Marcus stood outside the door for nearly half an hour without saying a word. When I finished, he stepped inside and asked, "Who in the world are you supposed to be?" I laughed and told him, "The man who unclogs the second-floor toilets on Tuesday nights." He never pushed me for more, but after that he started looking at me differently. Not with pity, just curiosity, and there was a difference. The truth was, before the uniform and the cane and the rent notices, I had studied at the New England Conservatory on a full scholarship. At 27, I played my first major recital at Symphony Hall. And at 32, I performed at a diplomatic dinner in Ottawa after the scheduled pianist came down with pneumonia. That night led to invitations in London, Brussels, New York, and Washington. I played for 2 presidents, a prime minister, and Queen Margrethe of Denmark during a cultural summit in Copenhagen. I had a manager, magazine profiles, recordings, and a black tuxedo rousette made me look like I owned a small country. Then the pressure behind my eyes started climbing. The surgeries failed, and the edges of the world narrowed until faces became shapes, shapes became shadows, and shadows became nothing. I could still play, better than ever in some ways, because my ears learned to catch what my eyes had once distracted me from. But the industry no longer knew how to sell me. Producers wanted interviews about courage, survival, and inspiration. They wanted photographs of me touching keys with my eyes closed, television hosts squeezing my arm while asking how I overcame tragedy. I kept telling them I was not trying to overcome anything. I was trying to perform music, but they heard what made good television and ignored the rest. When I refused to become their miracle story, the calls slowed down, then stopped. Ruth said we would rebuild on our own, but she died before we got the chance. And after that, I packed my concert scores into a cedar trunk, locked it, and took the first steady job that would have me. By the time Victor Langley rented the Halcyon Crown Ballroom for his annual Arts Foundation Gala, almost nobody remembered my name. Victor was 61, a real estate billionaire who treated charity like a mirror, something useful only when it reflected him well. His foundation funded youth music programs across Pennsylvania, at least according to the banners, though every brochure featured Victor in a larger photograph than any child receiving help. He had donated the ballroom piano, a Bossendorfer concert grand worth more than my entire apartment building, and attached a silver plaque carrying his full name and 3 honorary titles. He loved that piano the way some men love a portrait of themselves, not because of the sound, but because everybody had to notice who paid for it. The gala was scheduled for 7:30 that evening, and the hotel had spent 2 days preparing. Florists came to the loading dock with white orchids. Chefs shouted over copper pans. Television crews tested lights. And Victor arrived at 6:40 in a dark blue Bentley with his second wife Celeste walking half a step behind him. I was near the service corridor when I heard him berate a young violinist named Lena Brooks, a conservatory student invited to open the program. She introduced herself politely, and Victor asked his assistant, loud enough for her to hear, whether the actual musicians had arrived yet. Lena went quiet, and I heard the small scrape of her shoe as she stepped backward. That sound stayed with me because I knew it. The sound of someone making herself smaller so a powerful man would feel larger. At 7:15, the featured pianist called from the airport. His flight had been diverted to Baltimore because of heavy fog, and there was no chance he would make the performance. By 7:40, the event coordinator was crying behind a curtain while Victor told her failure was simply incompetence wearing makeup. Every substitute in the city was booked, unreachable, or unwilling to perform with 10 minutes notice. Meanwhile, I finished my shift, returned my cart, buttoned my coat, and started toward the back exit. I should have gone home. I had instant soup waiting, a final rent warning on the counter, and no room in my life for trouble. Then somebody opened the ballroom doors, and a technician tested the Bossendorfer with a single E-flat chord. That sound traveled to the corridor and settled inside my chest like it had been looking for me. I stood there with my cane raised above the floor, listening until the chord disappeared. And somewhere beneath all the years, all the grief, all the silence, the man I used to be took one slow breath and opened his eyes. I should have kept walking. And for a few seconds, I tried to convince myself that was exactly what I was going to do. 12 steps to the service door, 5 minutes to the bus stop, 40 minutes back to my apartment where the pipes would knock and the soup would taste like salt and nothing would be asked of me except to survive another night. But my body had already turned toward the ballroom before my mind agreed to it. I knew that room better than most of the guests inside, not by sight, but by distance and echo. 3 service tables along the east wall, a wide aisle beside the bar, 4 shallow steps leading to the stage, and the piano positioned slightly left of center, because Victor had once complained that the silver plaque did not photograph well from the right side. I moved slowly, tabbing my cane ahead of me, listening to the crowd murmur beneath the chandeliers, and nobody stopped me because a man in a maintenance uniform is allowed to go almost anywhere, as long as he looks like he is there to clean up someone else's problem. The ballroom felt different that night, charged and impatient, hundreds of voices trying to pretend they had not noticed the empty stage, silverware touching china, glasses being lifted and set down too carefully. The restless little noises people make when an expensive evening is not unfolding the way they were promised. I reached the first step, then the second, and just as my cane found the edge of the third, Marcus caught up behind me and whispered, "Isaiah, what are you doing?" I told him the truth, which sounded ridiculous the moment it left my mouth. "I am going to see if that piano remembers me." Marcus went silent, then said, "Man, that piano has never met you." I smiled a little and answered, "They all know the same language." He could have stopped me. He probably should have. But Marcus had heard me play in the employee lounge, and somewhere in him curiosity beat caution by half a step. He took my elbow, guided me around a microphone stand, and led me to the bench. The Bosendorfer was close enough that I could feel the polished wood radiating the warmth of the stage lights. I reached out and touched the edge of the fallboard. Smooth, cool, nearly perfect. And for one impossible second I was 32 again. Ruth sitting in the second row wearing the red dress she saved for important nights. My manager pacing in the wings. An audience waiting for me, instead of waiting to be rid of me. Then, Victor Langley's voice cut through the room. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" The question came from 10 feet away. Calm and sharp, the way a knife can be calm. I turned my head toward him and said the featured performer was not coming, and I thought I might help. There was a brief silence, then a laugh from one of the men standing near him. The dry little laugh of somebody checking which side of power to stand on. Victor walked closer. His shoes made no sound on the carpet until he stepped onto the stage. Then the soles clicked against the polished wood. 1, 2, 3. Each step measured. "Help," he repeated, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "You clean bathrooms here." Marcus moved between us and said, "Mr. Langley, he knows the instrument." Victor replied, "I did not ask what he knows. I asked why he is touching my piano." His piano. That was the center of it. Not the music, not the ruined schedule, not the 300 guests wondering why they had paid thousands of dollars for dinner in silence, but ownership. Victor would rather leave the instrument untouched than allow the wrong man to make it useful. I stood up because I did not want to argue while seated, and that was when his hand closed around the front of my coat. He pulled me away from the bench so hard my shoulder twisted, and Marcus said, "Sir, let him go." But Victor was already performing for the room. He shoved me once, not enough to knock me down, just enough to remind everyone who was supposed to move for whom. My cane slipped from my hand, struck the edge of the stage, and rolled down the steps onto the marble floor below. A few guests gasped, somebody muttered, "Jesus." And then came that laugh near the champagne tower, quick and ugly. Victor leaned close and said, "Do not put those filthy hands on a $250,000 instrument." I could smell bourbon, mint, and the expensive cologne men wear when nobody has ever told them they use too much. Marcus stepped forward again, but 2 hotel managers appeared at the side of the stage, both terrified, not of violence, but of offending the foundation chairman who booked the ballroom every year. One of them told Marcus to stand down. The other whispered my name like a warning. I bent carefully, feeling along the stage floor for the edge, trying to locate the steps without my cane. And Victor kept talking because men like him mistake silence for permission. He asked who had let the blind roach out of the basement, then said the bleach fumes must have damaged what was left of my brain. Another man laughed, louder this time. Most of the room did nothing. That part mattered more than I wanted it to. Cruelty is rarely just one person. Sometimes it is one person and 100 witnesses calculating what speaking up might cost. My foot found the first step and I lowered myself to the marble, searching beneath the nearest table while shoes shifted away from my hands. Nobody helped until Lena Brooks, the young violinist Victor had insulted earlier, crouched beside me and whispered, "Your cane is by the next table, sir." She placed it in my palm, and her hand was trembling. I thanked her and started to rise. I had every intention of leaving. I pictured the rent notice, the empty apartment, the way losing this job would turn a bad month into a disaster. Pride does not pay a landlord, and dignity sounds noble until the refrigerator is empty. I had learned to swallow a lot over the years, not because I lacked courage, but because survival makes compromises sound reasonable. Then Victor called after me, loud enough for the ballroom to hear, "Go on, janitor, play something." The men around him chuckled. He continued, "Show everyone what those bleach-burned hands can do. Maybe give us a little street music before you go back to the mop closet." I stopped, I wish I could tell you I turned around because I was fearless, if that would be a lie. I was afraid of being fired, afraid my hands would fail, afraid that 15 years away from a real stage had turned memory into fantasy. Most of all, I was afraid Victor was about to prove something I had secretly believed for years, that whatever I once was had died with Ruth, and the man left behind was only pretending the music still lived in him. My fingers tightened around the cane, and in that moment I heard Ruth's voice as clearly as I had heard the E-flat chord in the corridor. She used to say, "When somebody invites you to become smaller, Isaiah, do not be rude enough to accept." I took one breath, then another, and turned back toward the stage. The crowd grew quiet as my cane touched the first step. Victor said, "Oh, he is serious," and somebody beside him laughed again, but it came out weaker. I climbed to the bench without Marcus's help this time. I folded my cane and placed it carefully beside my right foot, then ran both hands over the keys without pressing them, feeling the slight differences in temperature between ivory and ebony, mapping the keyboard the way I mapped my apartment walls. The instrument was beautifully maintained, the action light, but not shallow, the keys responsive beneath the smallest pressure. Whoever tuned it had done honest work. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a piano owned by such a man could still possess such integrity. Victor stood near my left shoulder and said, "Do not embarrass yourself." I answered, "Sir, embarrassment is not the thing I am worried about." He asked what was. I rested my hands above the keys and said, "Whether this room deserves to hear it." That quieted even the people who had been laughing. I adjusted the bench half an inch backward, rolled my shoulders, and listened. Every concert hall has a note before the first note, the hum of lights, the breath of the audience, the building settling around expectation. I had forgotten how much I loved that silence, how alive it could feel, and how terrifying. My left hand began to shake, not much, but enough that I felt it in the knuckles. I placed one finger on middle C, then lifted it again. Behind me, Victor made a soft, impatient sound, and the old panic rose in my chest. The memory of hospital rooms, canceled dates, promoters speaking slowly as if blindness had made me stupid. I almost stood up. I almost told Marcus to take me home. Then somewhere near the front, Lena whispered, "You can do this." 4 simple words, spoken by a young woman I barely knew, and they reached the place in me that had been locked since Ruth died. I began with the piece I had not performed publicly in 17 years, the opening of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. Low and restrained, the left hand laying down a dark pulse while the right answered above it. The first measure came out stiff. The second was cleaner. By the fourth, the room had vanished, and the piano was no longer Victor's. The hotel was no longer a hotel, and my uniform was no longer proof of anything. There was only wait, release, breath, and return. I heard chairs stop moving. I heard a glass touch a table and remain there. The tremor left my hand. The rhythm deepened, each chord opening wider than the one before it, and the Bosendorfer answered with a richness that rose through the bench into my spine. I knew then that my hands had not forgotten. They had only been waiting for me to stop punishing them. The prelude gathered force, marching forward with that fierce Russian certainty, and when I reached the first great swell, I let the full weight of both arms fall into the keyboard. The sound struck the ballroom like weather. Somebody in the front row inhaled sharply. Marcus whispered something that sounded like, "Lord have mercy." Victor stopped moving. I could feel him there, but his presence had changed. No longer the center of the room, just a man standing too close to music he did not understand. I finished the prelude's final phrase quietly, holding the last chord until it thinned into silence, and before anyone could clap, I moved directly into an arrangement of Duke Ellington's Come Sunday, the song Ruth used to hum while making coffee. The transition surprised even me, classical thunder dissolving into something warm, bruised, and human. I played it slowly, leaving space between phrases, letting the melody lean and breathe like a voice trying not to cry. That was when the past opened all the way. I saw Ruth without seeing her, the red dress, the oatmeal tin, the little beads on the front door lock, her hand resting on my shoulder after the doctor said there would be no more surgeries. I remembered her saying we would build a life that did not require sight, and I remembered how angry I had been when she died before teaching me how to build it alone. The melody bent under that grief, then lifted again, not healed, but willing to continue. I heard someone crying near the aisle. Another person whispered my name, not the name on my crooked badge, but the name from the old recordings. Isaiah Bennett. The whisper traveled. Isaiah Bennett. Is that him? I had not heard strangers recognize me in years, and for one dangerous moment it nearly broke me. My right hand slipped on a grace note, but instead of hiding the mistake, I folded it into the phrase, repeated it, turned it into a question, then answered with a chord Ruth would have laughed at because it was far too sentimental. I could almost hear her say, "You always did know how to make an entrance." The song ended on a suspended harmony, and the silence afterward felt different from the one before I began. Not skeptical now, but stunned. I lowered my hands into my lap. Nobody moved. Victor was the first to speak. His voice had lost its edge. "Where did you learn to play like that?" I turned toward him and said, "In rooms where people listened before deciding what I was worth." Somewhere behind him, a woman began clapping. Slow and deliberate. Another person joined, then another. But before the applause could spread, an older voice from the center of the ballroom called out, "Do not stop." I knew that voice. Dr. Miriam Caldwell, former conductor of the Philadelphia Civic Orchestra, a woman who had once invited me to perform with them in 2001. She stood from her table and said, "Isaiah, play the one you wrote for Ruth." My breath caught. There were maybe 12 people alive who knew about that composition, and I had not touched it since the morning after her funeral. Victor asked, "Who is Isaiah?" Miriam answered him in a tone sharp enough to cut glass. "The man you just shoved is one of the finest pianists this city ever produced." Victor said nothing. The room waited. I placed my hands back over the keyboard, but this time they were shaking again, harder than before, because playing for strangers was one thing. Playing Ruth's piece meant opening a door I had spent 7 years barricading shut. I whispered her name, too softly for anyone except the piano to hear, then pressed the first note. The note was an A below middle C, soft enough that the room had to lean toward it. Then came a second note above it, then a third, and slowly the melody began to take shape. Not grand or impressive, just familiar, like hearing someone you loved moving around in the next room. I had written that piece during the last year of Ruth's life, though neither of us knew it would be the last. It began with the rhythm of our kitchen, the pipes knocking before dawn, the spoon tapping the coffee mug, her slippers dragging across the floor because she refused to buy new ones until the soles actually fell off. The audience could not know any of that, but music has a way of carrying details without explaining them. I played the way Ruth laughed when she caught me hiding emergency cash inside her oatmeal tin, the way she hummed off key while labeling my medicine bottles, the way she squeezed my hand in the hospital and promised that darkness was not the same thing as emptiness. Then the harmony shifted. The warmth tightened into something uneasy, chords pressing against one another. The melody searching for a place to rest and finding none. That was the phone call, the ambulance, the doctor speaking in a careful voice while I sat beneath fluorescent lights I could barely see. That was me coming home with Ruth's coat folded over my arm because nobody knew what else to do with it. My left hand dropped into the lower register, and the room filled with the anger I had never admitted. Anger at her for leaving, at myself for surviving, at every person who told me time would heal something they had never carried. The Bosendorfer shook beneath my hands. Glasses trembled on the tables. Somebody began sobbing without trying to hide it. I heard Marcus breathing behind the curtain, slow and uneven, and I knew he was crying too, though he would later claim the ballroom air conditioning had attacked his eyes. The music climbed, broke apart, then returned to Ruth's first small melody. Changed now, scarred but still standing. I did not resolve it into happiness because that would have been dishonest. Grief does not disappear because a story needs a satisfying ending. It simply learns where to sit. So I gave it a chair beside love, let the two remain together, and ended on a quiet major sixth. Unfinished enough to hurt, peaceful enough to breathe. My hands lifted. For several seconds the ballroom gave me nothing. No applause, no whispers, not even the scrape of a chair. Then Miriam Caldwell stood. Her knees were not what they used to be, so the movement took time, but nobody rushed her. She rose like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict and began clapping. Lena stood next, tears running down her face. Then Marcus stepped through the service door still wearing his security jacket. One table rose, then another, and suddenly the entire ballroom was on its feet. The sound hit me in waves, hundreds of hands striking together, shoes shifting, voices calling my name. I could not see any of them, but I felt the applause through the stage, through the bench, through the soles of my work shoes. For the first time in 17 years, I did not feel like a man remembering who he had been. I felt like myself. Victor remained close to the piano, silent while the room moved around him. When the applause finally softened, Miriam walked to the stage and took the microphone from the event coordinator. She told the guests who I was, not with pity, but with facts. She named the conservatory, the orchestra appearances, the diplomatic performances, the recordings, and the composition commission for the Copenhagen summit. Then she looked toward Victor and said, "The man you called a roach performed for heads of state before you learned how to spell philanthropy." The room reacted with a sharp mixture of laughter and shock. Victor stepped forward quickly, trying to recover the evening before it escaped him completely. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that he had thought I was damaging the instrument, that emotions had been high because the scheduled performer was absent. He spoke in the smooth voice wealthy men use when they believe the right vocabulary can turn cruelty into confusion. Then he faced me and said, "If I had known who you were, I would never have treated you that way." I turned toward his voice and felt something inside me settle. Not triumph, not revenge, just clarity. I told him, "That is the problem, Mr. Langley. You should not have needed my biography before deciding not to humiliate me." The room erupted again, louder than before. Victor tried to answer, but no sentence came. For once, money had reached a place where it had no useful language. Celeste moved away from him, only a few steps, but enough for everyone nearby to notice. Lena came onto the stage and took my hand. She whispered that she had been planning to leave the conservatory because people like Victor made her feel as if talent only mattered when it arrived in the right skin, the right clothes, and the right family. I told her never to hand her future to someone who had not earned the right to hold it. Marcus leaned close and said, "That sounded wise." I told him I had been saving it since lunch. He laughed so hard he had to turn away, and the whole room laughed with him. Not at anyone, just releasing the pressure that had built all night. By midnight, videos were already spreading online. By Monday morning, millions of people had watched Victor shove me away from his piano, then stand speechless beside it while I played. 3 sponsors withdrew from his foundation within a week. The Halcyon Crown removed his silver plaque from the bow sender for before the month ended. Victor issued an apology written so carefully that it managed to sound expensive without sounding sorry. Some people said his life had been destroyed over one terrible moment. Others said one terrible moment had merely revealed the life he had been living all along. Miriam helped arrange my return concert at the Kimmel Center, and I agreed on one condition. Part of the proceeds would fund scholarships for working adults, disabled musicians, and students who had been told they were too inconvenient to invest in. We named it after Ruth. Lena became the first recipient. On the morning the program was announced, I woke at 5:10 to the same knocking pipes, made the same coffee, and counted the same steps through the same small apartment. The rent notice was still on the counter, though Marcus had already helped me negotiate more time, and my uniform still hung behind the door. I reached beneath the bed, pulled out the cedar trunk, and opened it for the first time since Ruth died. Inside were old concert programs, signed scores, photographs, and the black bow tie she always said made me look important. I held it in both hands and laughed because I could almost hear her correcting me. Not important, Isaiah. Respectable. There is a difference. I sat there until the coffee went cold, then whispered. I finally stopped making myself smaller. Ruth. The apartment stayed quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Now I want to know what you think. Did Victor deserve to lose his sponsors and reputation? Or should one public apology have been enough? And be honest, if you had been in that ballroom when he shoved the blind janitor to the floor, would you have stood up before the music proved he was somebody? Or would you have waited with everyone else? Tell me in the comments. Share this story with someone who has ever been judged by a uniform, a disability, or the work they do. And remember this, the person you overlooked today may be carrying a whole concert inside them, waiting for one moment of courage to be heard.